Daniel hears stage 4 and goes home rehearsing how to tell his wife before time runs out when her own confession detonates the life. He thought he knew grief and betrayal collide with the countdown in his lungs. He must decide what to hold on to. Anger, truth, or the last scraps of grace. When the doctor spoke those words to me that afternoon, it felt like the air in the room had thickened into something I could hardly breathe. His lips moved in slow motion while my brain tried to arrange the sounds into something that made sense, but the only phrase that stuck was stage 4. I remember staring at the framed degrees on the wall, the smell of antiseptic, the faint hum of the fluorescent light above his desk while I tried to picture what stage 4 looked like inside me. I thought about the dull ache that had been creeping into my chest for months and how I had blamed it on the air conditioning at work or maybe the new gym routine that I never really kept up with. Turns out it was my lungs quietly giving up on me. I drove home in silence that day with the windows down and the cool wind stinging my eyes. The world outside was so painfully normal that it almost felt cruel. People crossing streets carrying coffee cups, teenagers laughing at bus stops, sunlight glinting off car roofs, as if nothing in the world had changed. But for me, everything had shifted. I could already feel the invisible countdown ticking somewhere deep inside me. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights had dimmed in the neighborhood. My wife had gone to bed early, saying she was tired from work. I wanted to follow her upstairs, wake her gently, and tell her that I might not be around for long. I wanted to say that I was terrified, that I wasn't ready, that the thought of leaving her alone made my chest tighten more than the cancer ever could. But I couldn't bring myself to speak. The words stayed trapped in my throat, heavy and sharp like stones. Instead, I stared at the cup of cold tea in front of me, thinking about how ordinary things would keep happening even after I was gone. Bills would still need to be paid. The mail would still arrive. The lawn would still grow. There was something both comforting and devastating about that. Life would continue to exist in all its small, quiet details without me. Over the next few days, I moved through routines like a ghost. I woke up at the same time, got dressed, went to work, smiled at people, and answered emails. But underneath it all was a strange detachment, like I was watching someone else live my life. I caught myself studying the people around me, wondering if they had any idea how fragile everything really was. When I watched my wife moving around the kitchen one evening, humming softly while she chopped vegetables, I thought about how much I loved that sound and how I might never hear it again in a few months. I rehearsed the conversation in my head over and over. I would take her hand, lead her to the couch, and explain everything slowly. I would tell her that we still had time to make memories. I would ask her not to cry too much because I needed her to be strong. I imagined her resting her head on my shoulder, whispering that we would get through this together. That picture gave me enough courage to finally decide that I would tell her the next day. But when the next day came, things went very differently. She came home from work looking pale, her eyes red, as if she had been crying. I assumed maybe someone at the office had upset her, so I told her to sit down and take a breath. I was about to start speaking when she suddenly broke down completely. Her body shook as if something inside her had given way. Before I could even form a word, she began to talk through her tears, and what she said froze me in place. She thought I knew. She said she could not keep living with the guilt. She said there was someone else and that it had been going on for months. I remember the way my hands went cold against the table, the distant sound of a car passing outside, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator that seemed louder than her voice. She said she had fallen for a man from work, that they had made a mistake that had turned into something more. She said she was pregnant. For a long moment, I could not even hear my own breathing. The only thing I could feel was the strange hollow space opening up inside me. I looked at her face, the woman I had promised to spend my life with, the person I thought would hold my hand when the world began to fade, and all I could think was that I did not recognize her anymore. I had walked into that evening ready to tell her that I was dying. Instead, I sat there realizing that, in her own way, she had already buried me long before the cancer ever could. And as she kept talking, trying to explain how it had happened, I felt something shift quietly inside me. Not anger, not yet. Just an overwhelming stillness, like the moment right before a storm when the sky forgets to breathe. That was the night I understood that dying would not be the hardest part. Living through what came next would be. The next morning, the house was quiet in that heavy way that follows a storm, even though no storm had happened outside. The air itself felt bruised and uncertain, as if it too had overheard the things said the night before. My wife had slept in the guest room, a fact that I only realized when I woke up alone and saw the cold, untouched side of the bed. Her pillow smelled faintly of the lavender spray she used every night, and that familiar scent twisted something deep in my chest. I went downstairs and made coffee the way I always did, but the taste was wrong. Everything felt wrong. The mug was too heavy in my hand, the light through the window too bright, the sound of the birds outside too cheerful. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam curling from the cup, trying to understand how my world had managed to collapse in two different directions at once. I was dying and I had been betrayed. I wanted to feel rage or grief or something clear and sharp, but all I felt was the dull hum of disbelief. She came downstairs a few minutes later, her steps hesitant on the wooden floor. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen, her voice soft when she said my name. I didn't respond right away. She stood across from me waiting, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I could see her hands trembling slightly as she tried to find words. She started saying that she never meant for things to happen this way, that she had been lonely, that I had seemed distant. I suppose she was right about that, though she had no idea why. I had been distant because I was dying. I had been too scared to tell her. She had taken that silence and filled it with someone else. I listened to her explanation, but it sounded like a recording from a place I didn't belong to anymore. When she mentioned the pregnancy again, I felt something inside me finally snap into focus. The reality was undeniable. The child she was carrying wasn't mine and never could be. We had tried for years with no luck, and when we finally gave up, I thought we had accepted it together. Apparently, she found a new way to fill that emptiness while I was busy preparing for my death. She asked if I hated her. The strange thing was I didn't. Hate felt too alive, too heavy for the kind of emptiness spreading inside me. What I felt was closer to absence, the hollow echo of love that had been carved out so thoroughly there was nothing left to cling to. I told her that she should move out soon, and she nodded without protest. She said she would need a few days to gather her things. Her calm acceptance stung more than anything else. It was as if she had already moved on emotionally long before the words were spoken. For the rest of the day, I went through motions that no longer made sense. I answered work emails, made a sandwich, washed the dishes. Every ordinary task felt like an act of defiance against the absurdity of my situation. I caught myself wondering if anyone could tell just by looking at me that I was a man quietly running out of time, whose wife had just told him she was carrying another man's child. But people smiled at me in passing, none the wiser. Life has a strange way of pretending everything is normal even when it isn't. That evening, after she left to spend the night at a friend's place, I sat alone in the living room and pulled out the folder of medical papers from the hospital. I read through every line again, even though I already knew what they said. There was a comfort in the precision of medical language, the way it reduced chaos into words and numbers. The report said months, but didn't say how many. I tried to imagine what those months would look like now, stripped of everything that had once given them meaning. I thought about calling my parents to tell them about the diagnosis, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of hearing my mother's voice tremble or my father's silence stretch out on the other end of the line felt unbearable. They would want to visit, they would want to hope, and I didn't have the energy to manage anyone else's hope. Not right now. Instead, I sat there and thought about her, the woman who used to laugh at my terrible jokes and fall asleep with her hand resting against my chest. I remembered the way she used to talk about growing old together, about traveling when we retired, about the garden we would someday have. I wondered if she had ever really believed those things, or if they were just placeholders for the version of love she wanted at the time. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I made a decision. I would not tell her about the cancer. She didn't deserve that truth anymore. If she had already chosen another life, another man, another child, then my illness was no longer her burden to carry. I would face it alone. I would let her go quietly, without guilt or explanation. She would think I was just heartbroken and distant. She would never know that I was fading in a way no one could fix. By the time the sun rose, the decision felt strangely peaceful. The light coming through the window fell across the floor in long pale lines, and for the first time in days I felt something close to clarity. I couldn't control how I was dying, but I could control how I lived what little time I had left. I folded the medical papers back into their folder, closed it carefully, and placed it in the drawer. I would deal with it when I needed to. For now, I wanted to feel the morning air one more time while it still meant something. The following week passed in a haze that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I still woke up at the usual time, brushed my teeth, and made breakfast, but every movement felt like an imitation of habit rather than living. My wife still came by occasionally to pack her things, but she moved through the house like a stranger, now quiet and careful, avoiding my eyes, as if afraid to step on the fragments of whatever we used to be. I didn't stop her. I let her take what she wanted because none of it mattered anymore. The night she left for good, I stood at the doorway watching her load the last box into her car. She turned to me once, her expression unreadable, her mouth opening like she wanted to say something, but then she closed it again and drove away. The sound of the engine fading down the street was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. When the silence finally settled, it was almost a relief. I spent the next day cleaning the house. It wasn't dirty, but I needed to keep moving because stillness made my thoughts too loud. I scrubbed the kitchen counters, wiped the mirrors, vacuumed the carpets, and took out bags of old clothes to donate. Every small act of order gave me the illusion that I still had some control over the chaos that had taken over my life. When I was done, the place looked spotless but emptier somehow, like a hotel room after checkout. At night, I started reading again, something I hadn't done in years. I found an old collection of essays about travel and philosophy and began underlining sentences that felt like they belonged to me. The author wrote about how people spend their lives preparing for tomorrow as if tomorrow is a promise rather than a privilege. That line stayed with me. I realized that for the first time in my life there was no tomorrow that I could plan for. Every plan I had ever made now seemed absurd. Retirement savings, vacations, home, repairs, all meaningless in the face of a ticking clock that no one could reset. I began keeping a small notebook where I wrote down the things I still wanted to experience before my time ran out. It wasn't a dramatic bucket list full of skydiving or world travel, just quiet things. Watch the sunrise from the beach one more time. Cook the recipe my father taught me when I was 16. Call my sister and actually listen to her talk about her life instead of rushing through the conversation. Things I had always postponed for later. I wanted to make sure later didn't disappear before I noticed. One afternoon, while I was out walking through the park near my house, I saw a young couple sitting on a bench laughing over something on a phone screen. The woman leaned her head on the man's shoulder, and for a second the sight hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't jealousy exactly, more like a wistful recognition of something I used to have and had lost in such an ordinary way. Love had ended not with shouting but with slow erosion and secrets whispered in offices. It made me wonder how many people around me were walking through similar quiet heartbreaks, invisible to everyone else. A few days later, I received a message from one of her coworkers, a man named Philip, whom I vaguely remembered meeting once at a company party. He said he wanted to talk about something important if I was willing. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and we met at a small cafe near downtown. He arrived looking uneasy, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. He told me he didn't know the full story, but that there had been gossip in the office about her relationship with another colleague, the one she was now living with. He said he thought I should know because the affair had apparently started long before she admitted it, and that several people at work knew about it. Hearing that didn't make me angry. It just confirmed what I had already sensed, that the version of my marriage I believed in had been over for a long time. I thanked him for telling me, and we parted ways. As I walked back to my car, I realized that I felt oddly detached, like I had just finished watching a movie whose ending no longer mattered. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the sky darken. The first stars began to appear, faint and distant like old memories refusing to fade completely. I thought about the man she was with and about the child she would soon bring into the world. Somewhere deep down I hoped that she would find what she thought she was missing with me, even if that hope felt hollow. Maybe she would learn something from all this. Maybe I would too. The next morning I made an appointment with my doctor to discuss treatment options, even though we both knew there weren't many. He explained the procedures, carefully outlining what could buy time and what might just make the last months harder. Listening to him talk about survival percentages felt like reading a manual for someone else's life. I asked him if it would hurt much, and he said they would manage the pain as best they could. That phrase, manage the pain, stayed in my head long after I left the hospital. On the drive home, I decided I wouldn't waste the time I had left hiding from the truth. If I was going to fade, I wanted to do it with some measure of grace. I wanted to understand the quiet edges of life that most people rush past without noticing. The smell of rain after dusk, the weight of sunlight on my face, the sound of wind moving through trees. I realized those things had always been there waiting for me to finally pay attention. That night I stood in the backyard barefoot on the grass, feeling the cool earth beneath my feet, and for the first time since the diagnosis I felt something close to calm. I couldn't fix what had been broken, but I could still choose how I spent what remained. The idea was strangely freeing. For a man running out of time, I had never felt more alive. A few weeks later my body began to whisper the first reminders of what was happening inside me. The cough that had once been occasional became a daily rhythm, and there were mornings when I woke up feeling like my lungs were lined with sand. Still I forced myself to move through the day with purpose. I went on long walks in the park near the lake, and sometimes I brought a small thermos of coffee and sat on a bench watching the water ripple under the wind. The ducks would drift lazily along the surface, and every now and then a child's laughter would echo from the playground nearby. There was something strangely comforting about that sound. It reminded me that life kept going whether I was ready or not. I had not spoken to my wife since she moved out, though her absence seemed to hum quietly in every corner of the house. Her shoes were gone, her perfume scent had faded from the bedroom, but sometimes when I passed the closet I could still see the faint mark where her suitcase had rested. Those small ghostly details hurt more than any argument could have. I avoided checking social media, but one evening while scrolling mindlessly I saw her profile picture appear on my feed. It was a photo of her standing in a park, sunlight behind her face glowing with that same easy smile that once belonged to me. I noticed the man standing beside her with his hand resting casually on her shoulder. He looked exactly how I had pictured him, younger, taller, his expression confident in that careless way of people who have not yet been forced to confront loss. I stared at the picture for a long time before closing the screen. Later that night, I found myself thinking about him not with hatred but with an odd curiosity. Who was he outside of the betrayal that had tied our lives together? Did he know about my diagnosis? Did she tell him how she had discovered the affair? Did he feel any guilt when he looked at her knowing what she had walked away from? I imagined he didn't. People rarely do. A few days after that I had a strange encounter that changed the quiet rhythm I had built around my isolation. I was at the pharmacy picking up another round of medication when a woman behind me in line tapped my shoulder. She asked if I was Daniel, and when I turned I recognized her instantly, though I had never met her in person. She was the wife of my wife's coworker, the man who had fathered her unborn child. I had seen her picture once when my wife had shown me photos from an office party years ago. Now she stood before me holding a prescription bag, her face pale, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion. She said she had been trying to find me for weeks, ever since she learned the truth. She had discovered everything after stumbling across messages on her husband's old phone. My name was mentioned more than once. She wanted to tell me she was sorry that I had been dragged into this mess. I could see the tremor in her hands as she spoke, and I realized she was as broken as I was. We sat together on a bench outside the pharmacy talking quietly while people passed us without a second glance. She told me that her husband had moved out and that she was 6 months pregnant. She said she didn't know what she would do next, that everything felt uncertain now. I listened without judgment because her pain mirrored my own. There was an unspoken understanding between us, two strangers connected by betrayal and loss. When we parted, she thanked me for listening and said she hoped I would find peace. I didn't have the heart to tell her that peace was running out of time inside me. That night, as I lay in bed, her words echoed in my mind. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out to her again, not out of romantic interest, but out of the strange comfort that comes from talking to someone who truly understands your pain. But I decided against it. We were both too wounded to carry each other's weight. Still, her face stayed with me long after. A week later, I received an email from my doctor reminding me to schedule another scan. I hesitated for a full day before replying because part of me didn't want to know how much the disease had spread. When I finally went in, the technician was gentle, the same woman who had done my previous scans. She smiled politely, but there was something in her eyes that told me the results would not be good. When I met the doctor afterward, he confirmed what I already suspected. The tumors had grown faster than expected. He suggested starting a new treatment immediately, but warned that it would be aggressive. I nodded and told him I would think about it, though in truth my mind was already elsewhere. The drive home felt longer than usual, and when I reached my street I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I sat in the car watching the house in front of me, wondering how much longer it would still feel like mine. Later that evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The text simply said, "I heard you were sick. I hope you're okay." It was from her, my wife. The message sat on the screen, glowing in the dim kitchen light, while I stared at it, trying to decide whether to reply. I typed out a dozen different responses, each one colder or kinder than the last, before deleting them all. In the end, I sent nothing. She didn't deserve to know the truth, not anymore. Still, the fact that she knew at all puzzled me. I hadn't told anyone except my doctor. The only explanation was that someone from the clinic had spoken out of turn, or maybe that woman from the pharmacy had mentioned it after recognizing my name. Either way, the secret I had guarded so carefully was now loose in the world. That realization made me feel exposed in a way the illness never had. I sat on the couch that night, staring at the dark window where my reflection looked faint and ghost-like, and I thought about how many versions of me existed now. The healthy man I used to be, the dying man I was now, the betrayed husband, the quiet patient. They all shared the same face, yet none of them felt real anymore. Then something unexpected happened. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at my door. When I opened it, she was standing there. My wife. The woman who had destroyed me, now standing on my porch in the same coat she used to wear on our weekend walks. Her face was pale, her eyes red, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She whispered that she needed to talk, that it couldn't wait. And before I could even decide whether to let her in, she stepped past me into the house as if she had never left. When she stepped into the living room, I stood frozen near the doorway, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile air between us. She looked around quietly, taking in the space that once belonged to both of us, her eyes pausing on the bare shelf where our wedding photo used to sit. I had packed it away weeks ago, unable to look at it without feeling the weight of what had been lost. She ran her fingers along the back of the couch, as if testing whether she was still allowed to touch things in this place. I asked her what she wanted, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. She said she had heard from someone that I was sick, and she needed to see for herself if it was true. I could tell she had rehearsed those words in the car before coming over, because they sounded too measured, too controlled. I told her I was fine because the truth didn't matter to her anymore. She looked unconvinced but didn't push. She sat down on the couch while I remained standing by the window where the curtain fluttered gently in the cool night breeze. She began talking about how things had fallen apart between us, how she regretted how it all ended, and how confused she had been. She said the man she was living with had turned out to be someone completely different from what she thought. She said he was possessive, short-tempered, and jealous. The word jealous struck me as ironic, considering how our story had begun. She said she had left him a week ago and had nowhere else to go because she couldn't face her family with the truth. Listening to her talk was like watching a stranger narrate a tragedy I had no part in. I felt pity but not warmth. She asked if she could stay for a few nights until she figured things out. I wanted to say no, yet the part of me that still remembered what it meant to love her couldn't bring itself to refuse. So I nodded. I told her she could take the guest room, the same one she had moved into before she left. The moment I said it, she broke into quiet tears that sounded more tired than apologetic. That night, as I lay in bed, I could hear her footsteps in the hallway, the soft creak of the floorboards, and the faint click of the guest room door closing. The sounds carried me back to when we still shared a bed, to the way she used to murmur goodnight just before drifting off. I realized I didn't miss her exactly, but I missed the comfort of belonging to someone, the simple rhythm of two lives intertwined before betrayal had untangled them. The next morning she was in the kitchen making coffee like nothing had changed. She asked if I wanted some, and I said yes, mostly out of habit. We drank in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. She asked again if it was true that I was dying. I looked at her across the table, the same table where she had confessed everything weeks ago, and said that I didn't want to talk about it. She pressed her lips together and nodded, but I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. For the next few days, she stayed quietly in the house, keeping mostly to herself. She cooked dinner, sometimes tidied up the rooms, and left notes on the counter asking if I needed anything. It almost felt normal again, though the silence between us said otherwise. Every time I caught her looking at me, there was guilt written all over her face, a constant reminder that pity had replaced whatever love she once had for me. One evening I returned from the park and found her sitting on the porch steps holding an envelope. She said it was a letter from the man she had been with. He wanted her back. She asked what she should do, as if I could still be the person who guided her through decisions. I told her it wasn't my place to answer. She said she didn't love him anymore, that she wasn't sure she ever had. I didn't respond. She looked at me for a long time before finally tearing the letter in half. Later that night, while she was asleep, I walked through the dark house, unable to shake the feeling that time was slipping faster than I could hold it. The medications were no longer helping much, and the coughs had grown harsher. I could feel my strength thinning like thread fraying at the edges. I went into the guest room and stood by the doorway watching her sleep. She looked peaceful in that dim light, her hands resting lightly over her stomach. For a brief second I wondered about the child she carried, whether it would ever know who I was, or that I had once loved its mother deeply enough to forgive what should have been unforgivable. The following morning I woke early before dawn and stepped outside into the cool air. The world was quiet except for the faint hum of distant traffic. I thought about all the things I had lost and strangely felt no bitterness, only an aching acceptance. My life had become a collection of moments like these, fragile and fleeting but still beautiful in their own quiet way. When I came back inside, she was awake, waiting for me at the kitchen table. She said she wanted to make things right before it was too late. She said she knew she didn't deserve forgiveness, but she couldn't bear the thought of me leaving this world without knowing she was sorry. I told her I had already forgiven her a long time ago, not because she asked but because I needed peace more than revenge. She started crying again, but this time there was something softer about it, as if a weight had lifted from both of us. After she went to bed that night, I sat in the living room watching the shadows shift across the walls. I realized that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, but it loosens its grip just enough to breathe again. I didn't know how much time I had left, but for the first time in months I felt that it might be enough. Days turned into weeks, and the air inside the house began to change, as if it too could sense that something inevitable was approaching. The scent of her cooking mixed with the faint medicinal trace of my pills, and together they created a strange, fragile calm. My body was growing weaker each morning, and I could feel my strength slipping away in quiet increments like sand falling through an hourglass. I spent most mornings sitting by the window with a blanket draped across my legs, watching the neighborhood come alive. There was a kind of beauty in seeing everyone else's life continue in motion while mine slowed into stillness. She had settled into a pattern around me, careful not to intrude yet always near. She made tea at regular hours, left folded laundry on the couch, and sometimes read aloud from the newspaper, even though she knew I barely listened. Her voice filled the room in that gentle rhythm I remembered from years before, when we still shared lazy Sunday mornings together. The difference now was that her words were heavy with guilt, though she never said so directly. One afternoon I found her sitting on the porch staring at the small potted plant she had brought from her apartment. She said it had once belonged to her grandmother, and that it bloomed only when left in sunlight long enough. I watched her trace the leaves with her fingertips, and I could see how thin she had become, how the weight of everything she carried had settled deep beneath her skin. She looked at me and asked if I hated her for coming back. I told her I didn't. I said that hate was a luxury for people who still had time to waste on it. She smiled faintly, though tears lingered in her eyes. That night, while she was cleaning up after dinner, I felt a sharp pain in my chest that made me lean against the counter. The world tilted slightly before my vision cleared again. She saw me stumble and rushed over, her face pale. I told her it was nothing, but she insisted on driving me to the hospital. I let her, even though I knew what they would say. At the emergency ward they ran tests and kept me overnight for observation. She sat beside the bed through the night, her head bowed against her hands. The next morning the doctor came in with the same measured tone I had grown used to. The cancer had spread further than before, and he recommended hospice care. He said it gently, as if it were a kindness. I nodded and thanked him while she sat frozen in silence. On the drive home she didn't speak. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When we reached the house she parked the car but didn't move. I told her it was all right, that I wasn't afraid anymore. She turned toward me and whispered that she didn't deserve to be here. I told her that maybe she did, because everyone deserves a chance to be better even at the end. Over the next few days she began rearranging the house to make things easier for me. She moved the bed closer to the window and brought in softer pillows. She cooked soups that reminded me of my childhood and left them warming on the stove. I could see that she was trying to atone for everything she had done, though neither of us said it out loud. The nights became quieter. Sometimes I would wake and find her sitting in the chair beside the bed, half asleep with a book in her lap. Seeing her there filled me with an ache that was not quite love and not quite regret, but something gentler than both. One evening, as the light faded into the long stretch of twilight, she asked if I had told my family about the illness. I said not yet. She asked why, and I told her that I didn't want them to see me like this, that I wanted their last memory of me to be whole. She nodded and said she understood, though I could tell she disagreed. The next morning when I woke, I found that she had written a note on the kitchen table promising she would help me make those calls when I was ready. I didn't know if I ever would be. Later that week, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to both of us in handwriting I recognized as my old friend Mark's. Inside was a simple postcard with a photograph of the lake where we used to fish every summer. On the back he had written that he missed me and hoped we could plan another trip soon. I stared at that line for a long time because it was both a wish and a farewell, though he didn't know it. I placed the postcard on the windowsill where the afternoon light caught the image of the water and held it there like a small memory frozen in place. That night she made tea for both of us and we sat quietly at the table without speaking. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was almost peaceful. I thought about how strange it was that the same woman who had once broken me had become the person helping me face the end. Maybe that was the final symmetry life had to offer. I didn't know if forgiveness could erase what she had done, but it could transform it into something less poisonous. Before she went to bed, she leaned down and pressed her forehead lightly against mine. It wasn't a kiss exactly, but something softer, like a silent apology. After she left the room, I closed my eyes and let the sound of her footsteps fade down the hall. For the first time, I didn't feel angry or frightened. I felt ready in a way that surprised me. The final weeks arrived so quietly that I almost didn't notice them begin. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden decline, just a slow drifting of energy that left me feeling lighter each day, as if gravity itself was releasing its hold. Mornings became my favorite time because that was when the world still felt gentle. The air would carry the smell of dew from the grass outside, and the sun would rise through the thin curtains in long stripes of gold. I would sit by the window with a blanket across my lap while she brewed coffee in the kitchen, her movements soft, measured, and unhurried. Sometimes she would bring the cup to me without saying a word, and we would share that quiet together. Words had long lost their urgency. My body was failing, but my mind had grown strangely clear. The fear that once lived in every corner of my thoughts had faded into something calmer, like acceptance shaped into silence. I began writing letters to the few people who still mattered: my parents, my sister, and my friend Mark. I kept them short and honest, free of any drama or pity. I thanked them for being part of my life and told them not to grieve too heavily. I wanted them to remember me as someone who had made peace with the inevitable. I left the envelopes on the desk in neat order, sealed and dated. She continued to take care of me, though I could see that the weight of each day pressed on her more than she let on. Her face had grown pale, her eyes tired, but she moved with determination, as if caring for me was the only thing keeping her upright. Sometimes she would sit beside my bed reading aloud from the book of essays I had once marked up with underlines and notes. Hearing those words again felt like tracing the edges of a circle finally closing. One evening as dusk settled, she asked if I ever regretted not telling her sooner about the illness back when we were still married, before everything had fallen apart. I told her that I used to, but not anymore. I said that if I had told her, then maybe she would have stayed out of guilt, and I would have spent my last days wondering if love or pity was keeping her beside me. She looked down and whispered that she deserved my silence. I said she didn't deserve anything she hadn't already given herself, but that, in the end, none of it mattered. What mattered was that we were both here now, trying to be decent to each other before the curtain fell. After that conversation, the air between us softened. She began leaving the window open at night so I could feel the cool breeze against my face while I slept. She hummed quietly, sometimes the same tune she used to hum years ago when we drove through the countryside with the windows down. I would lie there listening to her voice fading gently into the dark, and it always made me think of the sound of forgiveness, not spoken but lived. One morning near the end, I woke before dawn to find her asleep in the chair beside my bed, her head resting against the armrest, her hand still holding mine. The sky outside was beginning to pale, and for a moment everything felt perfectly still. I realized that whatever bitterness had once filled me was gone completely. What remained was gratitude for the simple fact that I wasn't alone. I had loved and been broken, and somehow in the breaking had found a kind of truth that made sense only now when time was almost over. That afternoon the hospice nurse came by to check on me, and after she left I asked my wife to take a walk with me down to the park. It was slow and awkward because my legs no longer obeyed easily, but she walked beside me, patient, steady, matching her steps to mine. The lake shimmered under the light, and a soft wind carried the scent of water and grass. I sat on a bench watching the ripples spread outward in gentle circles. She asked what I was thinking about, and I told her I was thinking about how water never really disappears, it just changes form, moves from one place to another, and keeps existing in new shapes. She nodded, though I could tell she understood what I meant without needing more words. That night I felt the exhaustion settle deep in my bones like a quiet signal that it was time. I lay in bed listening to the wind outside and the faint hum of the city beyond. She sat beside me holding my hand and whispering that she was sorry again and again, as if she could undo the past with repetition. I told her to stop because there was nothing left to forgive. Then I closed my eyes and pictured the lake one last time, the surface calm, the water catching light in endless movement. In the stillness before sleep overtook me, I thought about how strange life had been. How it had begun in noise and ended in peace. How even betrayal could become something that led to understanding. My breath grew slower until it felt like the world itself was breathing for me. The last thing I heard was her whisper my name like a prayer carried into the quiet. If there is an afterlife, I hope it is something like that moment just before the end when everything was soft light and air and forgiveness. If not, then this was enough.